Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Al-Shabaka's Policy Labs. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nadim Bawalsa. I'm the commissioning editor at Al-Shabaka, and I'm excited to be with you tonight, facilitating this discussion regarding an important and often misunderstood topic, the deceptive notion of peace building when it comes to Palestine and Ireland. The framework of peace building in Palestine and Ireland, premised on the idea of negotiations between two equal parties, is profoundly problematic in the context of continued colonization. Over the last few years, Western donors and policymakers have been reviving the peace-building initiative in Palestine through people-to-people projects. Using the Irish peace process as a model, they argue that dialogue between two sides is the only way forward. But this is deceptive, as it obscures the fundamental power asymmetries between Palestinians and Israelis on the one hand, and between the Irish and the British colonizers on the other. And it relegates human rights violations to a side issue. Why are these initiatives being revived? Who is reviving, funding, and promoting them? How has the notion of embedded peace in Northern Ireland been instrumentalized in order to justify these initiatives in Palestine? To investigate these questions and more, I'm joined this evening by Assistant Professor of Conflict Resolution at Trinity College, Dublin, Ciaran Browne, and Al-Shabaka's Senior Analyst, Yara Hawari. Dr. Ciaran Browne is Assistant Professor of Conflict Resolution at Trinity College in Dublin. He completed his PhD at Queen's University Belfast and has previously held positions at Queen's University in Belfast and Al-Quds Bard University in Palestine. His research interests center on conflict and transitional justice, commemoration and conflict and forced displacement, with a geographical focus on Palestine and the north of Ireland. He has written for peer-reviewed journals, including the Third World Quarterly and Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, and he's contributed op-eds in leading media outlets, including the Irish Times, the Globe Post, the New Statesman, and The Conversation. His forthcoming book in 2022 with Niall Gilmartin is entitled Exiles, Forced Displacement in Northern Ireland's Troubles. Dr. Yara Hawari is a senior analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She completed her PhD in Middle East politics at the University of Exeter, where she taught various undergraduate courses and continues to be an honorary research fellow. In addition to her academic work, which focuses on Indigenous studies and oral history, she's a frequent political commentator, writing for various media outlets, including The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and Al Jazeera English. She's also author of The Stone House, forthcoming in December 2021, a gripping novella which explores the power of intergenerational trauma in Palestine. Congratulations to both of you for your forthcoming books, and thank you both for joining us this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to inform our viewers of the format of tonight's lab. For the first 30 minutes or so, I'll pose some questions to Brendan and Yara. During the second half, Brendan and Yara will answer questions from you, our audience. Throughout the discussion, please submit your questions by clicking on Ask a Question at the bottom of your screens. And remember that you can vote on the questions you'd like asked. If possible, please direct your question to one of our speakers. I'll do my best to address as many of your questions as I can. So let's get right to it. Yara, I'd like to begin with you. In your recent policy brief, which we published in Al-Shabaka earlier this year, the piece is titled The Revival of People-to-People Projects, Relinquishing Israeli Accountability. In the piece, you explore how people-to-people projects are being revived by Western policymakers, and why this is a dangerous precedent in the context of Palestine. Can you tell us more about what people-to-people projects are? How are they related to Palestine, and why are they being revived today?
Yeah, Nadim, thanks for your question. And it's an important way to start off this policy lab. The people-to-people framework refers to projects that bring Palestinians and Israeli civil society actors together in so-called cooperation and dialogue. And these projects usually emphasize notions of understanding and peace building. Now, just a bit of a sort of a historical background to this. The precursor to people-to-people, or P2P as I'll refer to it for ease, was the track to diplomacy of the 1980s, in which back channels were used to create spaces for non-officials to discuss options of resolution, with the aim of eventually influencing those involved in track 1 diplomacy, where the formal negotiations between officials were taking place. But P2P really took off after the signing of the 1993 Oslo Accords, which widened the scope of track 2 diplomacy to include Palestinian and Israeli civil society organizations and actors that did not necessarily seek to influence officials, but really rather to create this better, so-called better understanding between the two peoples. And these kinds of projects would include, summer camps for youth, women's groups, environmental groups, etc. Now, the P2P framework began to decline quite significantly in the early 2000s, and this was as a result of a variety of factors, including the outbreak of the Second Intifada, the demise of the so-called Israeli left. These would be the people who would have traditionally taken part in P2P projects. And importantly, the emergence of a renewed consensus on anti-normalization in Palestinian civil society, which I can discuss a bit more later. Now, since this period of decline, it's actually more recently been revived. And one of the most recent monumental moments was when the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act was passed in the US Congress in December 2020. Now, what this act does, or did rather, is pledge 250 million over 5 years to two funds, with one specifically focusing on peace and reconciliation projects between Palestinians and Israelis. Now, at the time, media reports dubbed it as this move to restore aid to Palestinians after the long hiatus under the Trump administration. And it was even, celebrated as bringing momentum to the stagnant peace process. Now, behind this particular legislation was a lot of work and lobbying. And one particular organization which took credit for its passing was the Alliance for Middle East Peace, ALMEP, which explained actually that it was a result of a decade of advocacy by them. And it was inspired by the Irish peace process. Now, ALMEP cites this broad coalition of endorsers, which include a whole host of actors, including J Street, the New Israel Fund, and others. And all of the organizations, except for one that they mention, are avowedly Zionist. Now, back to the legislation itself. Although the rhetoric of the Partnership for Peace Act is one of peace and cooperation, a closer reading of the legislation actually reveals troubling loopholes, which allow for the complete undermining of Palestinian rights. And it was revealed in an earlier draft of the legislation that it prevented geographic discrimination on applying grantees from Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. So in other words, anyone, including Israeli settlers in the West Bank, could apply for this funding. The final version of the legislation actually no longer contains that language, but neither does it put forward any language that prevents settlers from applying for the funding. And as we all know, the Israeli regime settler enterprise in the West Bank is one of the most egregious of its crimes against the Palestinian people. Now, the provisions of the legislation also impose a series of stipulations for receiving the funding, including restricting Palestinian access to it should the PA pursue an ICC investigation into Israeli war crimes. And this is particularly notable considering that in February 2021, the ICC ruled that Palestine is under the jurisdiction of the ICC and thus allows for an investigation into Israeli war crimes in Palestine. So it's obviously highly problematic for a funding body to place these kinds of limitations on the distributions of its funds. And I think, one must really take seriously the question of sincerity of any peace and reconciliation efforts that limit funding on the basis of a people pursuing accountability from an international legal body against perpetrators of war crimes. Now, since the Partnership for Peace Act, we've also seen the US Palestinian Affairs Unit, which is the sort of downgraded US consulate here in Palestine, put out a call for proposals for P2P funding, encouraging Palestinians to apply. And I think, unfortunately, we'll also see this interest from a lot of other countries. And particularly, I fear that we're going to see this in relation to environmental projects as environmental justice becomes a sexier and sexier avenue to pursue, in which Palestinians and Israelis will be encouraged to work together to save the environment, without, of course, addressing one of the root causes of the destruction of the Palestinian environment, which is the Israeli regime. But I'll stop here, and I think we can go into the fundamental issues of this kind of work in the next question.
Thank you, Yara, for this introduction to what has been an active policy of Western powers, and what has clearly done nothing more but cement the status quo. Let's move to Brendan and to Ireland. Brendan, you've written extensively on conflict resolution and peace building in the context of the north of Ireland. Can you describe to us what the Northern Ireland peace process is about, what it looks like, who's involved, what is it silent on, and so forth?
Well, yeah, and first of all, can I say a big thank you for the chance to be here with you and to reflect on what I believe is an increasingly important and pressing issue. And along with my colleague and co-author on several pieces, Elaine Bradley, we've been critiquing the exportation of what many have considered to be a Northern Ireland peace model to Palestine for some time now. And my personal experience of being from Belfast, and therefore a product of peace building practices here in the north of Ireland, but also as someone who, as you mentioned, has lived and worked in Palestine for some time, has helped me to sharpen my thinking in this regard. And I've also seen and experienced firsthand some of the work that organisations involved in exporting the Northern Ireland model to Palestine and Israel. The peace process in Northern Ireland brought about an end to the most recent bout of conflict on the island of Ireland, a period of time often referred to as the Troubles, which began in 1969 and lasted over 30 years until the signing of an internationally endorsed peace accord known as the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement. And the conflict involved a range of actors, including Irish Republican paramilitaries, British and Loyalist paramilitaries, and also state forces, and claimed the lives of approximately 3,600 persons, the majority of whom were civilians. And it is suggested in terms of people affected that almost 1 in 3 persons growing up during this period of time were impacted directly by a conflict-related incident. And I grew up during the mid-1980s at a time when there was a discernible shift towards establishing the peace process. And so in many ways, I think I would be considered a child of the transition. I got plenty of firsthand experience of P2P events that are awfully similar to the events that Yara is referencing. I remember being a young Catholic boy going on these school trips with young Protestants from the opposite school and coming together and doing these. Our peace process in Northern Ireland was enthusiastically sponsored by international actors, not least the United States, but also the European Union. And crucially, for reasons we may touch on later, and I think Yara has already referenced them, it was heavily financed by an international fund for Ireland, referred to by Jonathan Powell as the great unsung hero of the Northern Ireland peace process. At its core, the 98 Good Friday Agreement is based on principles of equality, consent, and supposed self-determination, though for those who wish to identify as Irish, British, or both. And one of the features of the peace agreement is that governance in Northern Ireland is facilitated by cross-community support and a subsequent division of power. And the key thing to say, and without going into too much technical detail about the outworkings of power sharing, is that since the signing of the Accords, life in Northern Ireland is no longer characterised by daily shootings or bombings. There has been a marked decrease in conflict-related direct violence. The infrastructure of British security, including army barracks and soldiers on the street, etc., has significantly diminished. And as a result, society has been, in many ways, completely transformed. However, to argue that there exists this kind of utopian reality is completely disingenuous. I mean, significant issues remain unresolved, not least justice for victims and survivors, many of whom have never been able to secure convictions for the murder of loved ones. in terms of society itself, we are very highly divided, not only in terms of where we choose to live, but also when it comes to issues around education and where to send our kids. Protestants and Catholics, on the whole, growing up in Northern Ireland, are, as academic Peter Sherlow has argued, comfortably segregated. And this is most evident when we consider the fact that since the signing of our 98 agreement, we have actually enhanced this infrastructure of division by building more peace walls or more barriers. Socioeconomically, we have some of the most impoverished areas across the whole of the UK, and there exists an alarming amount of childhood poverty. And in terms of mental health, we actually have the highest levels of suicide in Western Europe per capita. So you do have to wonder at times, what exactly is it that we're lauding when it comes to the success of the Northern Ireland peace process? Moreover, when it comes to the strength of our peace process, this is routinely shaken by internal scandals, but also external factors. And if we take the issue of Brexit, for example, and the British government's stance with regard to upholding its commitment to international law with regard to this internationally sponsored peace agreement, it is clear that our success and our failure remains very much at the whim of a British sovereign who, as they have repeatedly shown in recent years, care very little about the people living in Northern Ireland. And whilst it may be quite an unpopular position to take, there is a body of academic work out there that points to a major elephant in the room, namely the fact that the Northern Ireland peace process is almost completely silent on its wider colonial history. Scholars such as David Miller, Bill Ralston, Robbie McVeigh, and others point to the fact that issues around colonialism and British oversight of the Northern Ireland peace process were not part of the conversation when it came to negotiating peace. It was just being treated as a legacy issue, and effectively what was happening was the blame was being passed on to two warring communities who simply just couldn't get along. And if we take another example as being the growing clamour around Irish unity and the call and any future calling of a border poll, it is worth reminding people that this is ultimately something that only the British Secretary of State can call at a time that they feel is right. So it is exactly this ignoring of colonisation as a factorial source in our own conflict and eschewing it as a frame of analysis when it comes to how we built peace that is one of the main reasons why exporting the so-called Northern Ireland peace-building model to Palestine and Israel is deeply problematic.
Brendan, thank you so much for that enlightening introduction to what the peace processes look like, or the so-called peace processes look like in the context of Ireland. I think for many of us in the Palestine context, the similarities are quite stark and very clear, and you know, unfortunately, but in the context of intersectional solidarity building, there's much room for solidarity building. But Yara, let's go back to you to talk more specifically about what exactly is at stake when we speak about these P2P projects. So can you elaborate on why they are so problematic in the context of Palestine? And we'll move next to Brendan for a similar question. But Yara, tell us, what is at stake in these projects? Who stands to benefit from them? And of course, by default, who stands to lose?
Yeah, and Brendan already, alluded to some very fundamental issues. That P2P seems to be very promising on the surface, and it conjures up all these kinds of hippie images of people holding hands and coming together amidst conflict. But the reality is that this framework is deeply problematic, and it actually presents fundamental epistemic as well as material obstacles for holding Israel accountable for its violations of Palestinian rights. And the reason is because this framework is premised on the understanding that there is a protracted conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, the whole two warring sides narrative that Brendan mentioned. And if only they could come together and have a chat, then everything would be fine. It doesn't identify Israel's settler colonization and military occupation as a root cause of conflict. And so what it does is it determines that contact and dialogue are the only way to end violence. And it creates this false parallel between the structure of oppression of the Israeli occupiers and the resistance of oppressed Palestinians. And one of the consequences of this is that when Palestinians refuse to sit with the oppressors, and have a chit chat, they're deemed irrational, they're deemed petulant, and even, they're cited as the obstacle to peace. Now, not only is this epistemologically and politically flawed, both local and international actors have also proven that P2P is ineffective because the vast majority of Palestinians don't want it. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, Palestinian civil society rejects by consensus the idea of P2P because the projects are not premised on the principles of international law or the recognition of Palestinian fundamental rights. Rather, they're premised on this normalization of Israeli society. And I think here I want to stop and unpack this term, anti-normalization. Anti-normalization is something which was coined and defined by Palestinian civil society. It signifies Palestinians' refusal to participate in projects, events, or activities that promote the notion that Israel is a legitimate entity, which would in turn normalize the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed. And so as a tactic, anti-normalization is this attempt to fight back against the legitimization and whitewashing of Israel's violence of Palestinian rights through the veneer of dialogue. And so an example of this kind of normalization would be is bringing Israeli and Palestinian women together to discuss the respective challenges that they face within their communities, with no mention of the fundamental imbalance between them, an imbalance which routinely subjects Palestinian women to violence by the Israeli regime. And importantly, we have to understand anti-normalization not simply as this principled stance, but as a political tactic that recognizes the defunct framework of Palestinian and Israeli dialogue and peace building that is not based on the fundamental principles of international law. And so for that reason, Palestinians see these projects as tactics specifically designed to allow for Israeli impunity. Now, of course, there are a lot of Palestinians, or there are some Palestinians that take part in these projects. And more often than not, these people are portrayed as leaders in their community and in the wider society. And this is not the case at all. As I mentioned, Palestinian civil society is very clear on these kinds of projects and also have made very clear their stances about those that participate. And I think for many, participation comes down to not a belief in this kind of work or that dialogue is the way to peace, but rather the access to benefits that comes with such works. Some of these projects provide permits, opportunities to travel, all of these things which are difficult to obtain for many Palestinians because the Israeli regime denies them of the freedom of movement. But it also presents an opportunity of notoriety, which I think many of them will have not achieved otherwise. And I think, and I'll end here, but this is a side note because it really is less important, but various third state actors have also commented in their project reporting that P2P and related work is ineffective and not successful, including the UK. And so these third state actors are continuing to pursue projects which they themselves have deemed ineffective.
Thank you, Yara, for expanding on these projects and just how deceptive and why they are so deceptive, and really part of what ultimately is an agenda, quite clearly. Brendan, let's move to your work, which delves more deeply into the problematic notions of exporting the notion of Northern Ireland peace building to Palestine. And an academic article you co-authored last year with Elaine Bradley in the Third World Quarterly. The piece is titled "Promoting Northern Ireland's Peace Building Experience in Palestine, Israel, Normalizing the Status Quo." You make a similar argument to Yara's, showing how the idea of exporting this style of so-called peace to Palestine ignores the very fundamental reality that it's in fact not peace at all. Can you elaborate on this? And more specifically, tell us more about the process of exporting this model? How and why is it being exported, and who is doing that?
Yeah, absolutely, and it does build on a lot of what Yara said there, and in the piece that you've mentioned, which we subsequently published a version of in Ireland's largest broadsheet newspaper, the Irish Times, we point to the fact that, first of all, there has been for some time now a growing industry around promoting Northern Ireland's peace-building experience abroad, in not just in Palestine, but in supposedly other intractable spaces. And those who do so include political figures, but also civic society actors, politicians, ecumenical persons, academics, diplomats, many of whom maybe played a role in some shape or form in terms of peace building in the context of NI, and who have subsequently been traveling to places like the Basque Country, Colombia, and also Palestine and Israel to give their experience on how to build peace. In the case of Palestine, Israel, there are groups and individuals from Northern Ireland, including NGOs and academics, who've been involved in promoting intercommunal dialogue and cross-community activities, similar to those that Yara has mentioned, and pointing to the case of Northern Ireland and its supposed success, whilst either being deliberately silent or willfully ignorant to the great disparity that exists when it comes to bringing, when it comes to power and dynamics between Palestinians and Israelis. And in so doing, there has been a steady influx of organizations traveling there to promote their version of how to build peace, whilst all the while eschewing their support for Palestinian resistance to colonization. And in addition, many of these NGOs and individuals host groups from Palestine and Israel in Northern Ireland to promote how to build peace. And Elaine and I have since referred to this as plastic peace building, because the peace that they promote, we argue, is not peace at all. It is a form of pacification, promoting cross-community dialogue and reconciliation, all important in their own right, but only when the time is right. Rather than supporting an end to Israeli apartheid and a reversal of ongoing processes of Israeli settler colonialism, these dialogue and reconciliation events provide a ruse of peace and serve to further fragment and divide an already fractured Palestinian society. And those who vigorously promote the Northern Irish example are emphasizing a certain form of peace building, the success of which in our own context is dubious to say the least. But crucially, they're doing so at a time when Palestinian civic society has called on the international community to show solidarity with the colonized people and to do all they can to hold the Israeli state accountable for its multiple flagrant breaches of international law. Moreover, they often receive sources of funding from governments to promote these types of intervention at a time when their governments are simultaneously involved in enabling Israeli settler colonialism by failing to enforce basic principles of international law, which is the very definition of talking out of both sides of your mouth. And it may seem harsh to say, but I would suggest that it is by virtue of their ignorance towards the very context into which they are transposing their version and interpretation of peace building that those who see the Northern Ireland experience as exportable become, unwittingly or not, part of the problem. Many of these projects and the personnel running them refuse to countenance the language of colonialism or decolonization, because perhaps that's unsurprising, given that that language is almost completely absent in the Northern Ireland context. As I noted before, the Northern Ireland model, therefore, is like the perfect fit, for it too is silent on its broader colonial history and has all the required cheerleaders in place needed to promote its success. This form of peace building is about reinforcing, as everybody will know on the call, and protecting Western interests. It's about conflict management rather than agitating for reform. They would much rather continue the charade of peace, inject continuous flows of cash to manage to conflict manage. And so the Northern Ireland experience is a useful tool in that it provides all the appropriate language that is central to the optics of peace. And it's hardly a surprise, as Yara rightly mentioned at the very beginning, that the International Fund for Israeli and Palestinian Peace has been established, modeled on the International Fund for Ireland as a blueprint. And I think just to draw that together, I think it's worth recalling the words of Packby on this specifically, in which They note that dialogue, healing, reconciliation processes that do not aim to end oppression, regardless of the intentions behind them, serve to privilege oppressive coexistence at the cost of co-resistance.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you both for such an illuminating discussion. I think the parallels are quite clear between the two contexts. And I'd like us now to, that was perfect timing, by the way, thank you both for sticking to the agenda. I'd like to encourage, first of all, the audience to continue to submit questions over the next 30 minutes. I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. But we have a few that have been submitted over the last 30 minutes that I'd like to pose. Some of which I'm interested to hear both your perspectives on, if you wouldn't mind. So let's begin with the concept of decolonization. And this question was particularly asked in reference to Palestine. What does decolonization look like? Can it be based on equality or a separation fundamental to that reality? I'm curious as to whether, well, certainly this question I'd like to ask to Yara, being in Palestine at the moment and also being a senior policy analyst, but also to Brendan. And Brendan, if you would like to draw from the Irish context to respond to this question in terms of, I mean, to the extent that the North of Ireland has been decolonized, as you mentioned, in terms of the improvements since the Troubles, if this can be described as decolonization in Ireland, what does that look like, and to what extent is separation still part of that reality?
I think when talking about decolonization, we have to be very careful not to conflate equality and decolonization as the same term. And unfortunately, that's been happening increasingly so because of the use of the apartheid framework. Now, when we talk about Israeli apartheid, we are not simply talking about ending inequality. We're talking about a process of decolonization. So that includes the repatriation of indigenous life and land. And by that, I mean, you can look at South Africa for a very clear example. Okay, the political apartheid certainly ended there, but economic apartheid didn't. It continued. The land continued to be held in white hands. Many of the material resources continue to be held in the sort of the hands of the white elite. So we're talking about a complete restructuring, rebalancing out of the relationship between the indigenous and the settler colonial. And so then it's a long process, and it's not something that can be packaged into one answer. And decolonization looks different for many people, but it isn't simply about giving Palestinians the right to vote. We have to address the ongoing theft, decades of theft of Palestinian land and of resources, and what does due compensation and repatriation look like in the case of Palestine. So this is a huge topic, and there's a lot of material written on decolonization. One of my favorite pieces on decolonization is decolonization is not a metaphor, and what it does is that it says that it's a very, and this piece says that this is not simply a hashtag or a throwaway term. It has to bring about very real material things to the table, and that piece was written by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang. So I think everyone should read that piece.
Thank you, Yara. Over to you, Brendan.
Yeah, it's a massive question. It's especially when it comes to all the stuff that is happening on the island of Ireland at the moment. When it comes to thinking about Ireland's future, there's a lot of energy. I'm sure your viewers will be aware as well. There is a lot of energy around looking at Ireland's position within Europe at the moment, and given all that's happening in the United Kingdom and with Brexit. So we're actually having a lot of very interesting conversations around what any future island would look like, and how minority communities or minority rights can be respected within a new new constitutional framework. I mean, the language of decolonization in Ireland, I think, and the realities of decolonization are vastly different to the situation in Palestine for many reasons, not least the fact that I think when we first talk about British colonization in Ireland, you're going way back to the 1600s and the plantations and issues like that. But our framework and our families and our connections are so intermeshed and interwoven now that it's not simply a case of people leaving the island and reclaiming the land in that regard. It's a sense of understanding how everybody on the island might conceive of a new Ireland together, and I'm quite energized around some of those conversations that are happening, because we really have to do this now. It's very pressing, and if we look at some of the issues that will need to be considered, not least around language rights, for example, on the island of Ireland, need to be looked at more seriously. Where does unionism fit within a new Ireland? How are unionists represented in an all Ireland 32 county Ireland? So these are all very live questions that we're thinking about at the moment.
Thank you. I'd like to sort of try to combine two questions that are thematically connected. This next question, please, would be directed to Yara. Yara, given the end of the two-state solution as we know it, would you say it is necessary to engage with Israeli Jews to fight this new kind of normal that is still fundamentally defined by settler colonialism and inequality? And in answering that, would you be able to give any examples of Israeli and Palestinian groups engaging or working with one another in a way that doesn't ignore the occupation or the asymmetry of power, but is somehow working towards ending structures of inequality?
I mean, it's a good question. My answer would be, why can't we set a very basic benchmark of the recognition and enabling of basic Palestinian fundamental rights for a prerequisite to any kind of dialogue? I mean, why is that so bizarre? That, why is it bizarre for me to say that I will not sit or hang out or have a chit chat with Israelis who don't believe in my humanity simply so that you can take a picture for your funding reports and feel good about yourself? I have no problem with the international community wanting to work with Israelis on rehabilitating them, on working with them to understand the regime in which they live under. But why do Palestinians have to do this work? Why is it on Palestinians to do the labor of the work that Israelis should be doing, and the international community, which is deeply complicit in the Israeli regime? Why is it not on them to do that work? And I think, there's also a common comment is, why can't you just move beyond your grievances and work together? These grievances are ongoing. This isn't a past historical event that happened. This is an ongoing grievance. We are not in a post-conflict situation. We are in a continuous settler colonial project. Every day Palestinian land is being stolen. Every day Palestinians are being incarcerated. Every day Palestinians are being shot and killed. And so it's not about moving, letting bygones be bygones. It's actually about setting a very basic benchmark for dialogue, the recognition of Palestinian fundamental rights, the recognition that Palestinians have the right to live free of military occupation, have the right to return home to their homes of origin, have the right to live as equal citizens. These are not big demands. These are very fundamental demands in international law. And it's so bizarre to me that this is, such a minimum request that Palestinian civil society consensus has made, and it's being thrown back in their faces as something that's unattainable and unachievable. And so, in answer to where Palestinians and Israelis do work together in that framework, there are Israeli anti-Zionists who work on BDS within their societies, and who actually work on educating Israelis about the Nakba, about their role as settlers in the land of colonized Palestine. And that is their responsibility. Their responsibility is to work on their society and on their community. For Palestinians to do that work, I think is a pretty obscene demand.
Thank you, Yara. The next question I'd like to ask is for Brendan. In your field and your research as someone with a background in conflict resolution and sort of taking apart the notion of sort of these structures of funding and power that end up sort of supplementing these initiatives. What can you tell us about this notion of an aid culture when it comes that is so often plastered onto these peace building initiatives, and certainly on the former two-state solution model? Well, it's still with us, but not very let's say alive anymore. How would you see dependency on foreign aid in Palestine specifically hindering efforts to, let's say, seek accountability at the ICC? And maybe Yara, I'm sure you have much to say on this as well. Let's start with Brendan.
So can you reframe the question a little bit? Sorry, if that's okay.
So just if you have anything to say about what can you say about the culture of aid, foreign aid, that's so part of these initiatives when it comes to peace building? Would you say how does it hinder attempts to hold regimes of power accountable, say at the ICC and so on? So the regimes of foreign aid and aid dependence.
Well, we have seen how damaging foreign aid influx into spaces in Palestine has been, and sort of the lack of joined up thinking when it comes to that type of aid, but also the conditions that are often put on aid. We've seen that relatively recently. A lot of European Union funding that is coming into certain projects are being premised on the basis that Palestinians must choose carefully who they choose to work with. For example, I'm reflecting on a project that I'm involved in at the moment when we were presented with almost a fait accompli that we weren't allowed to work with certain political actors or certain people on the ground, and so that dependency or that condition that is put on it, I think is deeply problematic. But I think we can strip this back even to its most basics, just like Yara did there. I mean, we have the frameworks. The frameworks exist. We have international law. We have these agreements that we have signed up to. That's the European Union, but also the international community. It's about enforcement. It's about saying that we agree to be bound by a set of rules, a set of structures, and it's up to us as international allies, for example, in this situation, to lobby for our governments to enforce the frameworks that exist already. You wouldn't need to have the aid if you actually brought about an end to what is causing the problems in the first place. So if we actually paid more attention to holding Israel accountable for its flagrant breaches of international law, then we wouldn't have to worry about all of the issues around aid. And just building on the back of that, I mean, you see donor communities, or you see donor countries trying to really safeguard their gains then by rebranding their aid and coming up with new languages and terminologies, trying to ask Palestinians to become, for example, resilient rather than changing their structures of oppression. So the framework to hold Israel accountable exists. It's about enforcing and holding our own governments accountable before international bodies.
Thank you, Brendan. Yara, if you have anything to say about, we have a brilliant couple of questions I'd like to pose together surrounding the notion of apartheid and to what extent, let me read the questions because they're quite thorough. Building on Yara's response earlier about what colonization means, would you consider that efforts by human rights organizations to reframe the so-called conflict through the apartheid lens can be harmful to describe accurately and address effectively the oppression of the Palestinian people? And to what extent is ultimately the apartheid framework, effective?
I think that's a really good question, because I think there are pros and cons to using the apartheid framework. I think epistemologically, I think it's a very good and accurate framework to describe the mechanism of oppression that is inflicted on the Palestinians. But unfortunately, more often than not, this term is separated from the wider context of settler colonialism. And so the inevitable context of consequence of that is that people talk about equality rather than decolonization. And so the idea of that, if tomorrow we sort of dismantled the apartheid structure and everyone had a vote, and everyone who lived between the river and the sea had a vote and could elect whatever government they wanted. Unfortunately, that doesn't address the historical harm that has been inflicted on the Palestinian people, the fact that most of their land has been taken from them. What happens to that land? What happens to the resources? There needs to be proper historical redress. And I think it's not to say that the apartheid framework lacks that. I think there is scope to develop that within the apartheid framework. But I think, unfortunately, one of the consequences is the focus on equality and not decolonization. And so that's where I think therein lies the problem. And just to give you, an example of that, we saw the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem release a position paper on the question of apartheid, and in it they said that the state of Israel had now become an apartheid regime. And that's also a problematic analysis, because it doesn't recognize the original sin of apartheid, the creation of apartheid in 1948, and the expansion of the apartheid regime into more Palestinian territory in 1967. So I think the problem lies with very shallow and undeveloped analysis of apartheid rather than the term itself. And I think a much fuller and comprehensive situating of apartheid within the settler colonial framework is much more beneficial to the Palestinian struggle and the recognition of Palestinian fundamental rights in their entirety.
Thank you, Yara. We're doing so well in answering so many questions and getting to so many important issues. I'd like to ask one more question for Brendan, and then sort of close with a question for both of you. That is a question that interests me. But in this question for Brendan, one of our viewers says that they often hear that the Northern Ireland peace process is as being referred to as a way to move forward with Hamas in terms of disarmament, separating from its military wing to gain international recognition, having it participate in politics, similar to Sinn Féin. Is the Northern Ireland model, in your opinion, applicable at all in this aspect of the Palestine-Israel context, Hamas more specifically?
Not really, to be honest. So I think there's maybe a slight misunderstanding there in terms of how Sinn Féin emerged, or what Sinn Féin and the provisional movement, their relationship at the time. I mean, Sinn Féin was the political voice of the provisional IRA, and emerged. It took its political platform and really came to the fore in terms of embracing constitutional politics in the 80s after the hunger strikes. But it did so on the basis that it had that mantra of the ballot box and the Armalite. It had a dual approach in that regard. And even when it came to the peace process, and it came to the Good Friday Agreement, one of the main sticking points for many unionists was the issue of decommissioning of arms and decommissioning of weapons. So the peace agreement was, and the peace arrangement was actually created on the premise that decommissioning would happen later on down the line. It was a major jump. It was a major leap of faith for unionists at the time. So it wasn't about the IRA decommissioning in advance of bringing about peace. So I think it's also a little disingenuous as well to say that Hamas should decommission. I mean, that again is shifting the optics and the realities as what's happening on the ground. I mean, Gaza, as everybody knows, is completely under siege, has been for 14 years, if not longer. So this violence and Hamas doesn't operate in a vacuum in that regard. So I don't think it should be on Hamas to be honest, to be decommissioning in that regard. And that's just a personal reflection on that. I don't know if Yara wants to say anything on that.
I mean, yeah, exactly. That's the point. You know, the issue isn't that Hamas is an armed political movement. The issue is that the people of Gaza are under crippling siege and have been so for many, many years now. And the rest of the Palestinian people have also been under settler colonial occupation. So I think entirely switching the premise of that question is important. But I'd also stress, you know, as Brendan insinuated or implied, you know, you can't, this isn't a copy paste situation. And this is the problem of the P2P framework, is that they are literally taking something which was deeply problematic in Ireland and which wasn't particularly successful, and trying to supplant it on the situation here in Palestine, even though Palestinian civil society has rejected it, even though many funders, they themselves, have said that it is not successful. And yet here we have it being revived and promoted because I think sheerly for optics, because there is no way to hold Israel accountable. There is no consensus on international consensus on actually upholding its regime. You know, we Palestinians are playing the ball game. We are playing the game that they imposed on us. We are saying, okay, you know, we will forego many of our rights that are not recognized in international law, and we will say that we want the minimum. We will take all our rights that are recognized in international law, and the international community is throwing that back in their face. And so this, I think, is another, you know, it's another example of you know, funders wanting to sort of fulfill optics rather than to move forward in terms of achieving Palestinian freedom.
Absolutely, the brilliant PR scheme, really. So the last question I have for both of you, and actually it came up as another question, which I think fits nicely with where our conversation is going. So to the extent that we can say that the shared experiences between Palestinians and the Irish, this isn't to say that this is insignificant, but they may be limited to shared experiences of colonial dispossession and injustice and power asymmetry. If this is the extent to which the experiences are shared, how can, and to the extent that they are not in fact similar contexts and that the Irish model cannot be exported to Palestine, where are avenues for solidarity and where are avenues for intersectionality, sort of beyond the obvious, maybe not obvious for many people in the world, but beyond what we know to be the shared historical and experiences of colonization and dispossession? Brendan, sorry, I can direct this to either of you, but this is to both of you, so as a culminating question.
Well, I think, I mean, I don't want to say that there aren't strong connections either. I mean, the Irish are, I mean, our Irish civil society and grassroots solidarity is very strong with the Palestinian resistance, and also I think the framework for support and solidarity exists. I keep going back to this. We have been given the very clear guidelines on what it is that we are being asked to do as comrades and as people interested in Palestinian liberation and Palestinian struggle. We have been given a very clear set of guidelines as to what we should be doing. We should be lobbying on the ground for disengagement with the Israeli state. We should be targeting our institutions that decide to forge connections with Israeli governments. We should be targeting big businesses that decide to make connections between Ireland and Israel. We should be looking at university links that are established that create an opportunity to inoculate the Israeli regime when it comes to their war crimes and their crimes against the Palestinian people. So PACB and the call for boycott is very strong in that regard in terms of giving us a framework, and we're very lucky to have it. I know when it comes to any issues that I have, you can respond you can send a request and get a very quick response as to how you should engage with certain things. And we do have very engaged senators in Ireland who are promoting Ireland taking a lead when it comes to issues around settlement goods, when it comes to making sure that the European Union is being held to account for labelling settlement produce as well. Ireland also holds at this moment in time the chair at the UN Security Council and has an opportunity to be a strong voice. Whether or not you believe anything will come from that is perhaps for another discussion, but I think Ireland is a good ally in that regard, and I think that is what makes me more critical of this plastic peace building, this faux attempt at trying to find false equivalencies. That gets me kind of pretty riled up. So I think we do have strong support networks and good connections, and I think we should amplify them. But as I say, we have the framework around which to do that already.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. You know, the Irish have this long history of solidarity with Palestinians among the grassroots. The latest iteration of which has been, you know, the writer and author Sally Rooney, who declined to publish her latest novel or to allow the publishing rights to an Israeli publishing house for her latest novel. And, you know, she put out a really excellent statement and stood firm despite really vicious attacks against her and really slanderous critiques of her. And as Brendan said, you know, there are guidelines and there is a very clear framework for that solidarity. I think the key now is to translate sort of that grassroots work into influencing the higher up political levels, because unfortunately, as it stands, the Irish government, as you know, many other European governments, are not where they need to be with regards to holding Israel to account for its violation of Palestinian rights. So it's really translating that popular and historic solidarity into a sort of a stronger force at the political institutional level that I think is key. And for Palestinians on their part, I think there is a lot we can learn from Irish history, and I think it's undertaught, and it's definitely not something that we know enough about. So I think it's also on Palestinians to read up more about the people who are in solidarity with them and their historic and ongoing struggles.
I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. This has been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Brendan and Yara, for joining us this evening and for sharing your expert insight into this important topic, exposing the colonial foundations of the so-called peace-building initiatives exported from Ireland to Palestine. You've made it clear just how dangerous it is to adopt this deceptive framework and to buy into it, and just how much the Palestinian people stand to suffer from continued revival and funding and promotion of projects which ultimately do little more than cement the status quo of occupation and colonization. While disheartening, the reality of just how shared and intersectional the Palestinian and Irish struggles for liberation are and have been within the context of ongoing colonization is cause for optimism. So thank you both for making these points towards the end. Connecting global struggles for justice and liberation is critical for many reasons, least of which is the increased awareness it brings to audiences around the world and the increased pressure it places on policymakers to effect meaningful change when it comes to condemning colonial regimes of power and to bringing about liberation. Thank you both for bringing this all to our attention. Thank you also to our audience all around the world for attending this lab this evening and for submitting your engaging thoughts and questions. Before we sign off, I'd just like to remind everyone that Policy Labs are a crowdfunded program of Al-Shabaka, and so we do rely on your continued support. If you're able to donate, please do so by clicking on the donate link that should now appear on your screens. From Amman, thank you so much for joining. Good evening and good night, and I will see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you.
Thank